bit more about the Yud Gimel Middos in general. First of all, you know the halacha that because the Yud Gimel Middos are treated as special kedusha, Devorah kedusha, so you're only allowed to recite them when there's a minyan. So if you're saying slichos and there is no minyan, so you don't say the Yud Gimel Middos, but the exception is if you read them as Torah psukim, that means with the trup. So I read it in the Torah, so I can read it that way. But otherwise, you don't say them because they're called Devorim Shebikdusha. Now, the idea, someone asked yesterday, who says there have to be 13? The Torah, Hashem says, Hashem kel racham v'chanan. It doesn't say there are 13. You're 100% correct. There is nothing in the Chumash itself that says these are 13 Middos. But Chazal do describe them always as the Yud Gimel Middos of Rachamim. And as I indicated, they are correlated in complicated ways to the Yud Gimel Middos of Rabbi Yishmael and even to the later Yud Gimel Ikrei Emunah of the Rambam. So it'd be fascinating to work out the correlations of all of these. So for example, Kal V'chomer, which is the first of Rabbi Yishmael's Middos, is Keneged, the first of the Yud Gimel Middos, which of course is Machlokas, what that is. Now, the Gemara doesn't tell us a lot about the Yud Gimel Middos of Rachamim. It talks about Hashem wearing a talis like a Shliach Tzibor and telling Moshe, Kishiyasu B'necha, when your children do these Middos, we talked about that yesterday, I will give them Rachamim. And then the Gemara also doesn't give you the count. And that's why there are so many opinions on the counting. But the Gemara does give you some brief commentary on some of the Middos. Not all, only very, very few. And the first comment it goes on is, Hashem, Hashem. Now, like Rabbeinu Tam, Hashem, Hashem are the first two Middos. And the Gemara comments on them. What is the meaning of the repetition of God's name twice? Hashem, Hashem. Let's go with Rabbeinu Tam. That's Midah number 1, Midah number 2. Yud Kei Vav Kei is, of course, the name of Hashem, of Rachamim. So the Gemara says, Ani Hashem, I am the God of mercy. Kodem sheyecheteh ha'adam. Before man sins, I show him mercy. And the second Hashem is, I am the God that shows man mercy when he sins and does tshuva. Right? So Hashem, Hashem, Ani Hashem, Kodem sheyecheteh ha'adam. Ani Hashem, Achar sheyecheteh ha'adam v'yaseh tshuva. So the obvious question is, why do I need Rachamim before I committed a sin, right? What is the midah of Rachamim? Kodem sheyechteh ha'adam. So there are a few pshatim that are given. One pshat that some Rishonim say is that even though Hashem knows you're going to sin, He does not punish you ahead of time, right? This is similar to what we learned about Yishmael, that when Yishmael is dying in the desert, so Hashem wanted to keep him alive by finding water, by showing him a well. But the Malachim argued, why should you keep Yishmael alive where his descendants are going to persecute Jews and kill Jews? And Hashem said, I look at him right now. Right now he is relatively righteous. I mean, he wasn't righteous, but relatively okay. So I'm not going to punish him. I'm not going to destroy him because of the sins that are going to be created in the future. I will come back to that in a moment. This is actually a Shver Gemara. But this is the famous teaching, Asher Husham. Asher Husham, God looks at us the way we are now. He does not look at what we're going to do in the future. So the Rosh says that the Ani Hashem, Kodem Sheyechteh Ha'adam, means there is divine mercy. Even though God knows you're going to sin, He is not going to destroy you, put you out of commission ahead of time. Now, a little parenthetical note, although I don't want to be marich on this right now. The famous question is the Ben Sorer Umorah. This is a famous question. The Marsha asks, other Mefarshim ask. The Ben Sorer Umorah is the rebellious son. Now, granted, the Gemara says it never really happens because there are so many conditions that have to be met. So it's not a Lamaisa idea. But when those conditions are met, what's the problem? The problem is, this is a kid, he's not even bar mitzvah, who ate and drank and stole meat and wine from his parents, so he could technically be put to death. So the question is, why are you putting him to death? I mean, even stealing is not, you're not chayav misa for stealing. Why would he be put to death for stealing? Or even disrespecting his parents or whatever? So the Gemara says, or the Mishnah says, this is called Nidain al Shem Sofo. He is not judged for what he did, but he's judged because of the probable outcome of this type of life. He starts stealing from his parents, eventually he'll steal from other people, and eventually he'll come to murder, like a drug addict. He'll come get addicted to things and come to commit crime. Therefore, the Torah says, let him die in a state of relative righteousness, rather than wait till he commits the crime for which he will deserve death. It's actually for his benefit. Nidain al Shem Sofo. He is judged not for what he actually did, but to prevent what he will eventually do. So the question is a very obvious question. This is a direct contradiction to the Maisa of Yishmael. By Yishmael, the attitude is, I look at you now, and Hashem is not going to look at you in terms of the sins that you're going to commit. Right now, you're a tzaddik, or relative tzaddik. By Ben Sora Mara, we have the other way. Even though you're relatively innocent, other than being guilty of theft, we're going to get rid of you in order that you shouldn't do the bad things of murder. So l'chayra, there's a stira between Asher Hu Sham, to put it in the technical terms, and Nidon al Shem Sofo. Nidon al Shem Sofo says, we look at what's going to happen. Asher Hu Sham says, Hashem does not look at what's going to happen. Hashem looks at your situation right now. Yeah.
How is there even a comparison? Because Yishmael, we're only talking about his descendants, whereas the Ben Sora Mara, Gufa himself, he's going to be doing the murder.
Yeah. So you're 100% correct. One of the terutzim actually is that we apply Asher Hu Sham when you're righteous and your descendants are going to do the bad thing. And we say Nidan al Shem Sofo when you're going to do the bad thing. That's exactly one of the terutzim that's given. The only question is, the Rush apparently does not go with that teretz, because the Rush actually explains, Ani Hashem kodem sheyechta, that God has mercy on you, even though he knows you're going to sin. So your teretz is a very good teretz. Your teretz is, in fact, one of the terutzim that is given, but l'chayra, the Rush seems to be indicating that even the sinner himself is given that mercy. So that's a question to think about, but nevertheless, that's how the Rush understands, I am the God of mercy before you sin, that I will not punish you, even though I know you're going to sin if you haven't done it yet. It's similar, although it's not exactly the same, to the related idea that Hashem does not count a bad thought as equivalent to a bad deed. Meaning, when it comes to a mitzvah, my thought to do a mitzvah already counts as something very meritorious. When it comes to an aveira, the machshava ra'ah is not treated as the same as the maisa. In fact, I believe the Levush says a very interesting chap, a little bit of a Paldinan Devorah here, and that's the following. We know that if you're davening Shemona Esrei, and the chazan is up to Kedusha, and you're still davening Shemona Esrei, generally speaking, you're not allowed to answer Kedusha, unless you're exactly up to that place. But let's assume you're in the middle of Shemona Esrei, you're not allowed to answer. So what do? You stop, you listen to the chazan, and have kavana that what the chazan is saying, he's being motzi you in Kedusha. So that way, you're not mafsik, you're not interrupting the Amida, but you're still yotzei Kedusha by the Chazan's Amira, right? Everyone is familiar with this halacha. So the Levush asks the Kasha, well, mimanavshach. The reason why he's motzi me is because of a principle, shomeya ka'ona. When I hear somebody do a mitzvah, it's as if I answered it, right? So mimanavshach. If I say shomeya ka'ona, that listening is like answering, then I was mafsik in Shemona Esrei. You can in Lumbus you could argue with that question. But the question is, if you're telling me my listening to the chazan is as if I said the words, then I interrupted my Shemona Esrei by saying the words. So how can you tell me I'm not allowed to say the words, but I listen to the chazan? Shomeya ka'ona. So says the Levush like this. This is an interesting chap. That we say, a bad thought is not the same as a bad deed, but a good thought is the same as a good deed. So, when I think to be yotzei, So lagabe, the mitzvah of answering kedusha, my good thought is a good deed. So for the good purpose, it's like I answered. But to say for the sinful purpose of being mafsik in Shmona Esrei, and that I say, no, a bad thought doesn't count as a bad deed, right? That's called palgina. You're taking the same thought. And lagabe, the mitzvah element, it's treated as an action. With respect to the sinful element, it's not treated as an action. Okay, so that's pshat number one in I am God before man sins, that even though I know you're going to sin, I don't count it as a basis for punishment. Now, the Maharal gives a whole second pshat. The Maharal says, hey, man needs the mercy of God even if they didn't sin at all. Because no person is entitled to live. No person has a right, so to speak, to have life. If God gives me life, it is always an act of mercy. It's an act of compassion. It's an act of rachamim. It's not coming to me. And therefore, even before a person sins, he needs the rachamim of Hashem, because life is not an entitlement. Life is a gift. Okay, so these are two explanations for what Rabbeinu Tam at least says is the first of the 13 Middos of Rachamim, the first Hashem, I am the God of mercy, Kodem Sheyech Ha'adam. Now, the second Midah seems to be relatively self-explanatory. I am Hashem, who shows you mercy after you sin when you do tshuva. When you do tshuva. In other words, Midah number 2 is the mercy that Hashem shows us when He accepts our tshuva. Again, that seems to be, basic and understood, but we're going to see that even on that, there's going to be a question. Yeah.
I understand that davening, if we're not davening with a minyan, we don't say the 13 midot, but if we're learning, let's say we come across the pasuk in Micha or in Chumash where it describes those midot,
yeah.
do we say them?
For sure you do. You're learning Torah. By the way, this is also the case, although the minhag in most learning is that when we say psukim, we don't say Hashem's name, we'll say Hashem. But Me'ikar Hadin, you're allowed to say the name of Hashem in the course of learning, as long as you say the whole pasuk. Now that's indeed an issue, because often the Gemara does not bring a whole pasuk. But if you're going to say the whole pasuk, you are permitted to say the name of Hashem in that pasuk, and some even say would be a mitzvah. Some even say would be proper to praise Hashem by saying His name, as long as you're reading a pasuk shalom. It is interesting, those of you that have the newer Gemaras, whether it's the Oz V'Hador Gemara or the New Vilna, may notice that one of the innovations they put on the side is every pasuk that the Gemara mentions, they give you the whole pasuk, which is actually very, very useful. So even if the Gemara only quotes 3 words, you now have the whole pasuk on the side, and therefore, if you want to read the whole pasuk, you're allowed to say the Shem Hashem. Now, Zemiros, of course, is a different issue, just to digress for a second. Zemiros generally do not quote whole psukim, but they do mention the name of Hashem. But there also, we say Me'ikar Hadin, the Zemiros have a din of prayer, have a din of tefillah, and therefore you can say Shem Hashem. But again, the problem is that sometimes the song of a zemer is you repeat it and say it over and over again. So it wouldn't be proper to say Shem Hashem if you're going to kind of repeat the phrase and not say the complete phrase. So as a result, it depends on what nigun you're singing, meaning some nigunim are consistent with Haskaras Hashem, and some nigunim are not consistent, and therefore people aren't always going to be sensitive to it. So most people have a minhag that they do not say the Shem Hashem in Zemiros either, although Me'ikar Hadin, it would in fact be mutter. Okay. All right, so we've done Midah 1, Midah 2. Now, the Gemara does not comment on a lot of the Midas. I just want to point out, though, when we get down to Erech HaPayim, long-suffering and patient, you understand that is the Rachamim that Hashem waits for you to do tshuvas, right? So you can see already a difference here. Hashem, before you sin, is, as the Rush says, God does not punish you even though He knows you're going to sin. The second Hashem is, Hashem accepts your tshuva. There's some stuff in between I'll get to later. Erech HaPayim is the rachamim of waiting until you do tshuva. That's a separate midah. That I sinned, I didn't do tshuva, but God will give me a time, get whatever the time is, God will give me time to rectify my ways. Okay. Now, again, we don't have a complete commentary on all of this, but I just want to mention the things that we do have a commentary for. Then it says, chesed, God is a God of kindness, compassion. The emes, God is a God of truth. Now the question becomes, why is emes a midah of rachamim? L'chayra, God is a God of truth seems to indicate God gives you exactly what you deserve. God does not deviate from the appropriate standard. That seems to be connected to Midas Hadin. What is Midas Hadin? Midas Hadin is, you get what you deserve. So why is that called Rachamim? Chesed v'emes. According to all Rishonim and according to all Mekubalim, by the time you get to Chesed and Emes, they are counted as two Midos of Rachamim, like all counts. So the Maral, again, asks the obvious question, in what way is Emes a midah of rachamim? So he says quite an amazing thing. He says the rachamim is that if you're zoche through emes, you're not going to be zoche through chesed. Now let me give it, and that's the rachamim. The rachamim is God will not use the chesed lens if you could be worthy through the MS lens. And that's a great hatava. Okay, let me illustrate this by a mashal. Maral does not use this mashal. Let's imagine you're taking a course in a real hard college course, statistics or whatever it would be, calculus. And the teacher is real hard. He gives these exams that are kind of impossible. And, some people study very, 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 very hard and they're able to get a good grade. Other people either don't bother, or even if they study hard, they just can't get the material, right? Very hard. So let's imagine that the teacher had a change of heart. It was his birthday or his anniversary or whatever it is. And he comes in the day after 30 students took a very hard exam. The teacher says, I've decided to change my ways. I'm going to give everybody an A, and I'm not even going to read the exams. We'll just rip up the exams. Everybody gets an A for the course. So, good news or bad news? Are you happy or are you sad? So, it kind of depends. If you didn't study and you were simply expecting you were going to get an F, and Baruch Hashem, you hear you're going to get an A+, you'd be very happy. Most people. Maybe you'd be embarrassed, but I say, even the Nama de Kisufa, even the bread of embarrassment, I'll take the A+ and be embarrassed a little bit. But let's imagine you're somebody who worked really, really hard. And let's even assume that you weren't naturally talented in that area, but you worked and you studied. And he's not even going to read your test. The fact that you worked is not going to make a difference. No one's ever going to know. You're going to feel hurt. You're going to be thinking to yourself, I worked so hard and it's not going to be acknowledged. So, the same thing here. There are people who work on their avodas Hashem, and they try to be better and better and better. And then there are people maybe who don't pay so much attention to it. But Hashem in His rachamim will show everybody rachamim. Well, for the guys who didn't work, that's great. Again, Na'amah de Kisufa, bread of embarrassment, but still, Baruch Hashem. But for the guy that worked, it's like, God is not paying attention to what I did. So the Maral says the following. When God is judging you, the first thing He looks at, He reads your test. The first thing He looks at is, do you deserve compassion or not? If you deserve it, it's going to be like a separate grading system. A because of effort, and A because of freebie. Meaning, Hashem is not going to just give you indiscriminate chesed, until He determines you're not zoche b'emes. But if you're zoche b'emes, meaning you deserve it, you're going to be zoche b'emes. And that's rachamim, because you might say, Why should God bother to grade the paper if everybody's going to get an A anyway? Why bother to grade the paper? Answer, it's a chesed of Hashem that He will acknowledge your effort and your work, even though the people who didn't work are going to get rachamim anyway. You see, that's a beautiful thought. Chesed v'emes, that Hashem has a chesed that He will first judge you by emes, as if to say, some people get an A because they worked and deserved it, and some people will still get an A because of rachamim, but there's going to be that difference. There's going to be a difference between the people who got it because of emes and the people who got it because of chesed, even though on some level you might say it's superfluous. Why does God have to read the exam? I understand that Hashem knows everything instantaneously, but in a sense, why does God have to read the exam if everybody's going to get an A? The answer is to validate and be machshiv the people who worked hard. So this is not in the Gemara, but this is the Maral's pshat in the midah of chesed and emes. Yeah.
Is there an asterisk on the A of the people who didn't work hard? Like, is there?
Of course there would be, because there's going to be. There's going to be a difference in the grade. Also, the truth is, it's a little more subtle. But even when the grade is going to be the same, there's going to be a sense of, olam haba, that this person got the grade because they deserved it. This person got the grade even though they didn't deserve it, and there'll be the embarrassment, the nahama de kisufa. Right? Nahama de kisufa. This expression. The Derech Hashem brings it from the Zohar, really. And Nahama de Kisufa means bread of humiliation or shame. That's the famous idea that if we were to get reward without earning it, there would be a certain shame. I know the famous kasha, this is probably, if you had to make a list of the 5 most commonly asked questions in Ohr Somayach, maybe other places too, is, Hashem gave us mitzvahs because otherwise we would be embarrassed by getting all good reward. So why couldn't Hashem make us without the embarrassment? And that way we don't need the mitzvahs, and we'll get the good stuff, and we won't be embarrassed. Hashem could have made us that we're not going to be embarrassed. Okay, good question. I'm not going to answer that now, but as I say, this is a popular Ohr Somayach question. Okay, alrighty. Now, the next one I want to talk about is the very last one, which is very interesting. Again, I'm skipping a lot in the middle simply because the commentary in Chazal and in Meforshim is fragmentary, although I hope to get back to them. And that is, so what do we say? No say avon. God carries our avon, pesha, v'chata'a. Avon, pesha. Now, first of all, those count as 3. He carries our avon, our pesha, our chet. Even though there's only one verb, no say, God carries, but we count this as 3 because avon, pesha, and chet are 3 different types of sins. So the Gemara explains, chet is a sin that is committed b'shogeg. I ate non-kosher food, I thought it was kosher. That is called a chet, an inadvertent sin. I didn't know you're not allowed to take pits out of watermelon on Shabbos. Inadvertent sin. Now, an interesting question is, a general question, why are inadvertent sins sins? We know they are. The Torah talks about sin offerings that you bring when you violate the Torah accidentally, right? Shogeg. Why is a shogeg sinful? I didn't intend to rebel against God. So what is the sin in chet? Why is a chet a sin? Why is it something that needs forgiveness? Why does it need kapara? So there's actually 2 different ideas. Why is a chet something that needs atonement? One is the poison idea, and one is the negligence idea. Let me start with the second one first. The negligence idea is that even in unintentional sin, there were things you could have done. There were investigations you could have made. Right? You ate non-kosher food, you thought it was kosher. Well, how much did you check? In other words, it is a sin because you could have checked things. Now, that may not be a good explanation in every case, right? Like Tinok Shanishba, etc. But one theory, so to speak, or one hesber of the inadvertent sin is that inadvertent sins involve negligence, carelessness, not caring enough. If you would have cared, you would have found out. That's aspect number one. The other explanation of why I need kapara is not because I sinned per se, but because I put poison in my soul. Poison is a perfect example. Let's say, God forbid, there are 2 bottles in the refrigerator. What Edith would put it this way. One is a bottle of water, and one is a bottle of hydrochloric acid. I mean, I hope nobody will be as stupid as to do something like that. But somebody reaches into the refrigerator, takes a bottle of water, which turns out to be hydrochloric acid. Now, the guy that did it is negligent, that's for sure. But let's assume in terms of me. I didn't do anything wrong. I wasn't negligent. I wasn't careless. I made the normal assumptions that any human being would do. Let's even assume it's labeled water. There's a sign on it. But the problem is, poison is poison. Acid is acid. Meaning the fact that you didn't do anything bad is not going to avoid the fact that you have been mashchis, your body in the case of acid. So sin is understood in the same way. Eating treif, desecrating Shabbos, contaminates your soul. It creates separation between you and God. It's poison. So when it's poison, you can't make the argument, but I wasn't careless, I did everything I could. Okay. Is that going to help you when you take poison in? No, it's not. It's not going to help you with sin, and therefore you need atonement. You need the korban chatas, or you need a tshuva, or you need something by which God can take away the damage. It's curative, takes away the damage. Right? So these are 2 different svaras, and they both could be true. 2 different svaras why inadvertent sin needs atonement. One we'll call the poison explanation, and the other we'll call the negligence or carelessness explanation. Right? You see, there are 2 different issues. One is focusing on your carelessness in not checking things out better. The other is saying, even if you did everything possible, so what? You brought the poison into your system. You need some process to cleanse yourself. Yeah, the question.
How should we apply this to the Beta Egel? Is it considered completely negligent or?
Yeah, so the Chet HaEgel is considered to be negligence because they should have understood from the 10 Commandments, etc., that God is not worshipped by intermediaries. So even though their kavanah was a good kavanah, but it was something they could be held accountable for. Okay, so that's the word chet. Chet means inadvertent sin. What is avon, right? No say avon, v'fesha, v'chat. Actually, by the way, I'm throwing out questions here. The order in the Yud Gimel Middos is actually not very clear because there's no say avon. Well, let me first say the 3, and then you'll see why the order is not so logical. An avon is an intentional sin that you do because of a taiva, a strong desire that you have difficulty controlling, even though you could have controlled it. But, you walk by and you smell delicious frying bacon or whatever it would be, and I got to have that bacon. Now, I know it's wrong, but I break down. And this could be treif, this could be gilui arayos, this could be chilul Shabbos. That's called avon. You did it on purpose. But you didn't do it out of spite. You did it out of taiva. Now that's worse than a chet, obviously, but that's called avon. Now pesha is the worst of all. Pesha means rebelliousness, spitefulness. That's the person who says, well, the Gemara gives an example. If the only food available for you is treif, and you eat the treif, again, it's not pikuach nefesh, that's called an avon. But if there's kosher and treif, and they're both equally good, let's say, and you choose the treif when you could have chosen the kosher, that's called pesha. That's an act of rebelliousness. Now, it's interesting that the poskim, this is a little ambiguous sometimes. The poskim debate, let's say somebody chooses treif not as rebelliousness, but just because it makes no difference to them, meaning they don't care. How do you characterize somebody who says, I don't care if it's kosher. I'm not doing it to spite God. Maybe I don't believe in God, right? I'm doing it just eino choshesh. Do I classify an eino choshesh as avon, or do I classify it as pesha? Or maybe it's even a chet if the guy doesn't believe in God. So in a sense, I mean, think about this. Let's assume I know that Orthodox Jews don't eat ham. I know that. And I intentionally eat ham, but I don't believe in God. How would you characterize that? It's very interesting. Is that an intentional sin? Well, it's intentional in the sense that I know that Jews believe that God said you're not allowed to eat treif. But it's not intentional that I believe that God actually said not to eat treif. I just know that that's what Orthodox Jews say. So technically, you could actually make the argument that the person is a shogeg. Okay, something to think about. Meaning, he knows that this is a violation of Jewish law, but he doesn't think Jewish law is binding on him.
Would that part be intentional, not believing?
So that's the question, right? So that's the question. So that's a big shaila. If one who knows the halacha but does not consider the halacha binding, is he treated as intentional or unintentional? Yeah.
When it's answer, do we only ask for forgiveness for chet and pesha, but not avon and slav?
Okay, I'll go back to that. So these are our three categories. Chet is unintentional, inadvertent. Avon is intentional through taiva. And pesha, in its worst case, is spitefulness, although there'll be some definition of how do you apply spitefulness to people who don't believe in God or don't believe in Torah. Technically, they're not being spiteful to God because they don't believe there is God. Okay. Now, in the Yud Gimel Midais, just look at the order, though. The order is a little peculiar. No say avon, v'fesha. So you're going from level 2 to level 3, higher level. And then v'chatoah, but then you go back to level 1. So assuming 1, 2, 3, meaning 1 is the lowest and 3 is the highest, the Yud Gimel Midas do not go in a 1, 2, 3 progression. They go to a 2, 3, 1. Now that's a difficult sequence. You can start from higher to lower or lower to higher, but how can you go from lower to higher and then go back to lowest? Okay, again, something to think about. We'll talk about this a little later on. Now, you then asked about Shemona Esrei, so let's look at that. Slach lanu avinu ki chatanu. We ask God to forgive us because of chet. Mechal lanu malkeinu ki fashanu. Mechila for pesha. Ki mochel v'soleach ata. So, problem is, you only mention 2 out of the 3. You mentioned 1 and 3. You mentioned chet, and you mentioned pesha. Why don't you mention avon? So the truth of the matter is, in Nusach Sfarad, you'll actually see of chet, avon, pesha. You'll actually see all 3. So your kasha is a kasha only in Nusach Ashkenaz. And I'm going to have to check it. The Meforshim asked the question. Right now I cannot recall the teretz, but I'll try to check into it and we'll talk about it. It's obviously a very good kasha. Okay, but that's on Yom Kippur. That's why we say as well, the Kohen Gadol in all of his confessions always said when it was his own confession, he said Chatasi Avisi Pashati, right, on himself, and when he confessed on behalf of the Jewish people, he again said Chotu Avu Pashu. There, the order, by the way, is logical. It's ascending. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Now, the last one, the 13th midah, is v'nakeh. V'nakeh means God will cleanse you. God will exonerate you. Now, in truth, this sounds great when you simply recite the Yud Gimel Midos. But when you open up a Chumash, you immediately have a problem, because v'nakeh is not the end of the pasuk. It says Hashem, Kel, Rachum, V'chanun, Erech, Apayim, etc. No say Yom V'cheshav V'chata. V'nakeh, Lo Yanakeh. No, actually, it's taking a turn here. But to be completely exonerated, meaning that there'll be no punishment. Lo Yanakeh, he's not going to exonerate you. And in fact, the next pasuk, which we don't count as the Yud Gimel Middos, starts talking about he'll visit the sins of the parents on the children. V'nakeh lo Yanakeh is actually the beginning of the punishment verses. Pokei avon avos. So, quite wisely, we don't finish the whole pasuk. We don't say v'nakeh lo Yanakeh. We say v'nakeh, and we count it as God exonerates. Now, the Gemara itself asks the kasha. Well, again, lefi pshuto, what it means is v'nakeh, with respect to exoneration, totally without punishment. Lo yanakeh, it's not going to happen. That's what the pasuk says. But Chazal interpret it this way: v'nakeh, sometimes God will exonerate you, and sometimes lo yanakeh, he will not exonerate you. So the question is, well, when will he exonerate me? When will he not exonerate me? Meaning, v'nakeh, lo yanakeh. So the Gemara says, v'nakeh la shavin. For those who do tshuva, God exonerates. And those who do not do tshuva, God does not exonerate. So according to the Gemara's interpretation, lo yanakeh is not a midah of rachamim. And the last midah of rachamim is v'nakeh. But the question is, we'll talk about this tomorrow, is what is the difference between midah 13 and midah 2? The second Hashem already says, God is the God that will show you mercy when you sin and you do tshuva. That's the second Hashem. Right? Ani Hashem kishe yechteh ha'adam v'yaseh tshuva. Midah 13 is God will exonerate you if you do tshuva. So the question is, what is the nafkamina between the second Hashem, which is like Rabbeinu Tam, the second of the Yud Gimel Midas, and the 13th Midah of v'nakeh? Of course, there's another technical question. That is, you're not supposed to divide psukim. Whenever you recite a pasuk, you're supposed to say a whole pasuk. And yet, v'nakeh lo yanakeh, we cut off the last two words of that pasuk. Okay, so we'll talk about these questions tomorrow. A very beautiful, beautiful maral that is masbir, the difference between midah number 2 and midah number 13, as well as the issue of lo yanakeh. Why don't we say it? Should we say it? And the like. Okay, we'll see you tomorrow.